G'day, I'm Garry Stevens, and welcome to the third season of the History in the Bible podcast. In this final season, I explore how the Jews and the Christians constructed new religions when they were sent spinning into the void after the destruction of the temple. All of the history about all of the books beyond the Bible. Episode 3.6, The Great Revolt Part 2, A Civil War Within a Rebellion. In the last episode, I discussed the situation in the area south of the province of Syria, on the verge of the Great Revolt in the year 66. All the ethnicities in the area, Syrians, Judeans, Greeks, Idumeans, Nabateans, Samaritans, were keen to maintain their rights and security against the others. All dreaded ethnic violence, and all looked to Rome to defend them. Since the time that Pompey had brought Roman might to the region, over a century before, the Judeans had embraced their role as policemen for the Romans, and savoured Jerusalem as the Roman seat of power. Rome was their protector, not their oppressor. Judean opinion changed after Rome moved the seat of government from the Judean city of Jerusalem to the Greek city of Caesarea Maritima on the Mediterranean coast in Samaria. The Romans enlisted Greeks, Arabs and Samaritans as a police force to maintain the peace. The Judeans panicked. Josephus identifies the spark that set Judea on fire. An argument over a synagogue. The month was May, the late spring of 66. Quote, Now at this time it happened that the Greeks at Caesarea had been too hard for the Judeans, and had obtained of Nero the government of the city. Now the Judeans that dwelt at Caesarea had a synagogue, whose owner was a certain Greek. The Judeans had endeavoured frequently to purchase the place, and had offered many times its value for its price. But the owner overlooked their offers, and raised other buildings upon the place, and left them but a narrow passage, and such as was very troublesome for them to go along to their synagogue. Then the warmer part of the Jewish youth went hastily to the workmen, and forbade them to build there. But as Procurator Gessius Florus would not permit them to use force, the great men of the Judeans persuaded Florus with the offer of 8 talents to hinder the work. Florus promised he would do for them all they desired of him, but left the sedition to take its full course, as if he had sold a licence to the Judeans to fight it out. End quote. Josephus hates Procurator Florus with a passion. In histrionic language, Josephus coruscates Florus' administration. Quote, Florus omitted no sort of rapine, or of vexation. Where the case was really pitiable, he was most barbarous, and in things of the greatest turpitude he was most impudent. Nor could anyone outdo him in disguising the truth, nor could anyone contrive more subtle ways of deceit than he did. He spoiled whole cities, and ruined entire bodies of men at once. Entire counties were brought to desolation, and a great many of the people fled into foreign provinces. End quote. The Judeans appealed to Cestius Gallus, the governor of Syria. They demanded the removal of his subordinate Florus. Gallus at first promised reforms, but was persuaded by Florus that all was well. A month after the incident at the Caesarea synagogue, Florus and his Greek and Samaritan auxiliaries looted a vast sum from the temple. An outraged city swelled with unrest. Florus was openly mocked in the streets. The procurator reacted by arresting some leading Judeans. When the Judeans continued their protests, Florus escalated by sending the auxiliaries to raid the markets. According to Josephus, thousands were brutally killed. But you can never trust Josephus about numbers. Whatever the facts, the city was inflamed. There are two interpretations of Florus' actions. First, we can follow Josephus and interpret his deeds as those of a callous and indifferent tyrant. Second, we can follow some modern scholars who believe that Florus thought he was simply following a demand from the Emperor Nero to extract as much money from Judea as possible. Regardless, Florus' actions fanned the spark that had been lit in Caesarea into a conflagration that engulfed Jerusalem. The Judeans were suddenly confronted with their worst nightmare. Rome had previously protected them from their local enemies. Now, a Roman procurator was using those same enemies to attack them. The Judeans had no option but resistance, not against the oppression of an imperial power, but against the failure of that power to defend them against their ancient enemies. In the face of a rapidly deteriorating situation, King Herod Agrippa II stepped in. Agrippa ruled a gaggle of inconsequential territories northeast of Judea, but could claim moral authority in Judea as protector of the temple. He and his sister Berenice, which is probably pronounced Berenike, publicly appealed for calm. Agrippa opposed the people's demand that he petition the Emperor Nero to remove Procurator Florus. The citizens of Jerusalem were having none of it. They ejected the king and his sister. The siblings retreated to their realm. With Agrippa's voice of conciliation driven out in disgrace, popular opinion swung in favour of outright rebellion. The captain of the temple led the mutineers. This was Ananias ben Nebudius, son of a former high priest. He forbade sacrifices brought by foreigners on behalf of the emperor. Now, this was tantamount to a declaration of independence. The rest of the summer of 66 was one of mayhem and murder. Judean militias slew Roman garrisons throughout the country. They seized control of the Roman fortress of the Antonia abutting the temple. Outside of the capital, the Sicarii captured the wilderness fortress of Masada, 50 kilometres or 30 miles, and a few days' unpleasant walk from Jerusalem. A Roman cohort housed in Herod's old palace struggled to maintain order. They surrendered in return for a guarantee of safe passage out of the city. The militias reneged and slaughtered them as they left their barracks. Romans were not the only targets of the militias. In an ominous harbinger of future events, the mobs attacked any of their own countrymen who opposed war, the rich in particular. They destroyed the townhouses of the Judean wealthy. They burnt the records of creditors and debtors stored in the temple. Even Ananias ben Nebudius was murdered. The revolution was already devouring its own children. Civil order in the city collapsed. The Sicarii, flushed with their success in taking Masada, attempted to gain control of Jerusalem under the leadership of the self-proclaimed Messiah, Menahem ben Yehuda. The Sicarii were overcome by their former colleagues, the Zealots. Menahem was executed. The Sicarii retreated back to their stronghold south of the capital. By the autumn of 66, Jerusalem was drenched in blood. Little of that had been spilled by the imperial authority. The Judeans had proved remarkably effective in dispatching Roman garrisons. They also proved even more effective at killing each other. The opening months of the Great Revolt was more a civil war than a rebellion against Rome. Late church fathers claimed that at this point Christians fled the region eastwards to the Greek cities across the Jordan where few Judeans lived. We have no idea if this is true. Their numbers could have been no more than 1,000, and more likely in the low hundreds. Judea awaited Roman retribution. The incendiary procurator Florus was long gone. His fate has been lost to history. There was only one man for the job, Florus' old boss, Cestius Gallus, governor of Syria. Through the autumn, he reluctantly rattled down the coast with a reinforced legion. It would all be over soon. Gallus thought he was conducting a police action to protect the Judean people from domestic terrorists. He must have cursed the incompetence of his former subordinate and regretted his inattention to the Judeans' complaints. By the middle of October, 5 months after the revolt erupted, Gallus had only just arrived in Galilee. Sepphoris, largest city in the region, fell without a fight. But Gallus was discomfited. In one engagement, the Sicarii, led by Simon Bar Giora, had inflicted sizable casualties on his force. King Herod Agrippa again tried to mediate a peaceful resolution. He was the only Judean leader to realise that the events of summer foreshadowed a Judean civil war that would cause as much misery as Roman intervention. The Judeans murdered Agrippa's ambassadors. A regretful Agrippa spent the rest of the war as an ally of the Romans. After the revolt was quashed, the Romans sent him back to a war-torn and devastated province as a purely nominal ruler. 30 years later, at the age of 77, Agrippa II died unloved by all and hated by many, last scion of the house of Herod. Gallus now knew he would have to march into the heart of Judea. He moved on Jerusalem in late October. For unknown reasons, after just 9 days, he decided to retire back to Caesarea Maritima. Perhaps he thought that by marching to the gates of the temple itself and demonstrating the power of Rome, the militias would soon stand down. There was no need, thought Gallus, to further endanger either the people or his own troops. Or perhaps the militias threatened his supply lines, and withdrawal was his only strategic option. Gallus' retreat proved to be a calamitous mistake. He was half a day out of the capital when his force was ambushed to the hills at Beit Horon. Leading the ambushes was the zealot Eleazar ben Simon, making his entrance onto the political stage. The Romans were almost annihilated. The survivors fled to Syria, amongst them a humiliated Gallus. Rome had rarely suffered so bad a defeat at the hands of mere provincials. The Judeans were proving to be formidable foes. The Romans had more troubles on their hands. Judeans and Greeks were fighting each other in cities as far afield as Alexandria. Not that that was anything new. Gallus' ill-fated expedition to Jerusalem had done nothing but turn peaceful Judeans against Rome and embolden the nation. Judean militias took the initiative and ventured to strike at the city of Ashkelon. This was a city on the Mediterranean coast, 70 kilometres or 40 miles southwest of Jerusalem. Ashkelon was an ancient Philistine town, which had never been within the Judean orbit. By this time it was a thoroughly Greek city, part of the province of Egypt. The Judean raid was a disaster, with thousands of militiamen killed. The Judeans learnt a hard lesson. They had no prospect of extending their revolt beyond their own borders. With the Syrian legion destroyed, a stunned imperial authority grasped that a full-blown revolt was underway. Rome had no ready reply to the Judeans. Months would pass before Rome could assemble a retaliatory army. During those months, from November 66 to April 67, the Judeans organised a provisional government. At its head was an aged Ananus ben Ananus. The elder had been high priest 30 years earlier. The historian Josephus esteemed him. Quote, "He was a venerable and a very just man, and besides the grandeur of that nobility and dignity and honour of which he was possessed, he had been a lover of a kind of parity, even with regard to the meanest of the people. He was a prodigious lover of liberty, and did ever prefer the public welfare before his own advantage, and preferred peace above all things, for he was thoroughly sensible that the Romans were not to be conquered." End quote. Like King Herod Agrippa, Ananus was a moderate in radical times. Ananus sought to stabilise the conflict, offering just enough resistance that Rome would understand that the Judeans had legitimate grievances. Once the Romans understood that, they would soon come to terms. Ananus reinforced the city walls and appointed generals to defend the regions. Amongst these was a reluctant Josephus, designated to defend Galilee. As Josephus bitterly tells us, his appointment was opposed by Rabbi Simon ben Gamaliel the Elder, grandson of Hillel, one of the founders of Rabbinic Judaism. Where Ananus has vanished from modern Jewish history, Gamaliel is venerated as a leading scholar, jurist and politician. While Josephus survived the war as a Roman favourite, Gamaliel was executed by the Romans. The victor of Beit Horon, the zealot Eleazar ben Simon, demanded but was denied a role in the government. Ananus regarded Eleazar as a dangerous radical and potential despot who would bring them all down. Ananus was spot on. Although spurned, Eleazar remained in the city, assembling a zealot militia who established themselves in the formidable citadel that was the temple precinct. While the Judeans were conveniently bickering and murdering themselves, Nero dispatched his avuncular old friend, General Vespasian, take command of the Syrian legions. Vespasian brought his army from Syria to that province's southernmost city on the coast, Ptolemais. We know it as Acca or Acco. Vespasian was soon joined by his son Titus, leading another legion from Egypt. For maps on this war, take a look at my site, www.historyinthebible.com. The father and son team spent the rest of 67 quelling the rebellion in Galilee. They faced two separate Judean forces. One was the official army of Ananus' Jerusalem government, led by our old mate Josephus. The other was a militia organised by the zealot John of Giscala. Once again, the largely Greek city of Sepphoris chose surrender as the better part of valour and gave up without a fight. Many other towns followed suit. Still, the Judeans put up enough resistance to keep the Romans occupied for months. Galilee was pacified by December 67. Josephus' army had evaporated, and the general himself in Roman hands. John of Giscala's militia put up a much better fight. Driven out of Galilee, some established themselves south on the coast and operated a successful pirate venture to disrupt Roman shipping. John of Giscala decided that his interests would be better served if he were in Jerusalem, not playing at tin-pot pirate. Josephus has a story about how John escaped from the Roman siege of his hometown of Giscala. Keep in mind that Josephus despised his military rival, but also keep in mind that John's treacherous behaviour would be repeated again and again throughout the war. Quote, "Now in the night time, when John saw that there was no Roman guard about the city, he seized the opportunity directly, and taking with him the armed men, together with their families, he fled to Jerusalem. Though the man was making haste to get away, yet did he prevail with himself to take out of the city along with him a multitude of women and children, as far as 4 miles. But there he left them. Those that were left behind made sad lamentations. And indeed there was a miserable destruction made of the women and children. Some of them took the courage to call their husbands and kinsmen back to stay for them. But John's exhortation, who cried out to them to save themselves and fly away, prevailed. He said also that if the Romans should seize upon those whom they left behind, they would be revenged on them. So this multitude that ran away was dispersed abroad, according as each of them was able to run. End quote. Nice one, John. With Galilee subdued by the end of 67, Vespasian settled back in the capital of Caesarea Maritima. He was still there in May 68, 1 full year after he had arrived in Ptolemais, and 2 years after the rebellion broke out. Why was Vespasian taking so long to march on Judea and its capital? True, he was busy suppressing the zealot pirates, plaguing Roman ships. But surely he could have been more active. Perhaps Vespasian thought that the revolt would soon collapse. He had good reason to think so. Jerusalem was descending into a 7th hell of chaos. The zealot Eleazar ben Simon, ejected from the government of Ananus, launched a coup. Eleazar failed to dislodge Ananus, but did manage to secure a base at the temple against government forces. Eleazar now found a ready ally in his fellow zealot, John of Giscala, who had suddenly appeared in the city with his sizable militia after fleeing Galilee. The two factional leaders mistrusted but needed each other. Eleazar was flush with money looted from the temple, but his warriors were few. John had the troops but no money to pay them. It was to be a marriage made in hell. Through late 67 and early 68, Ananus besieged Eleazar and his zealots in the temple precinct. With supplies diminishing by the day, Eleazar's ally, John of Giscala, wrote to the Idumean army for assistance. Idumea was the old Edom, tiny kingdom abutting the southern border of Judea. They were ethnically distinct from the Judeans, but shared a common religion, thanks to their forcible conversion by the Maccabean kings 2 centuries earlier. John announced to the people of Jerusalem that Ananus had deceitfully asked Vespasian to restore order in the city and retake it for the Romans. Ananus was obviously a traitor. The Idumeans responded to John's plea with righteous indignation. John's militia opened the city gates to the foreigners. They swarmed throughout Jerusalem. Ananus and his supporters were slaughtered. The Idumeans looted the city. Here is Josephus again. Quote, "The zealots and the multitude of the Idumeans fell upon the people as upon a flock of profane animals, and cut their throats. Those whom they caught in the daytime were slain in the night, and then their bodies were carried out and thrown away, that there might be room for other prisoners. And the terror that was upon the people was so great that no one had courage enough either to weep openly for the dead man that was related to him, or to bury him. But those that were shut up in their own houses could only shed tears in secret." End quote. Jerusalem was now in the hands of a tripartite alliance. Eleazar and his Judean zealots, John of Giscala and his Galilean zealots, and the Idumeans. They hunted out the remaining Roman sympathizers, killing anyone who looked at them funny. John's troops especially became known for their brutality. Meanwhile, at the southernmost border of Judea, the leader of the Sicarii, Simon bar Giora, had established himself as a warlord in the citadel of Masada, from which he raided both Idumea and Judea. Simon eventually established his militia in a camp outside Jerusalem, where he slaughtered all those attempting to flee the city. The city's civilians were trapped between a murderous fanatic outside the city and homicidal radicals inside. As Jerusalem cowered in fear from the militias, Vespasian began a slow and systematic campaign in Judea and across the Jordan in the Perea. You would think that at this point the warlords would unite against a common foe. Ha! You would be so wrong. Eleazar barricaded himself in the inner court of the temple, the highest ground. The Idumeans turned against John, killing many of his Galileans. John decided to hole up in the outer court of the temple, the intermediate ground. Amidst this bedlam, the remnants of Ananus' provisional government invited Simon and his sizable force of Sicarii into the city to settle things down. What could possibly go wrong? Eleazar in the inner temple found himself surrounded by John in the outer temple, who was himself surrounded by Simon's Sicarii and the Idumeans in the rest of the city. That at this point, Vespasian and his legions were conducting a leisurely pacification action in the surrounding countryside. The Judeans in Jerusalem were doing quite nicely slaughtering themselves without the least Roman help. At this point, Vespasian received electrifying news. Emperor Nero had committed suicide upon the revolt of the governor of northern Spain and the German legions. The throne was now up for grabs. Vespasian's troops acclaimed him as emperor. Vespasian thought he could rule as well as anyone else. His intuition would later prove prescient. So Vespasian departed in July 69 to take part in the fun in Rome. He would become emperor 5 months later. Vespasian left his son Titus to continue the war. The Judean warlords were determined to ignore the Romans in favour of fighting it out for supremacy within the city. The first to go down was Eleazar, who held the inner temple. At the festival of Passover, John of Giscala, who held the outer temple, asked Eleazar for permission to offer sacrifice. When Eleazar opened the inner doors, John's Galileans rushed in and murdered Eleazar's Judeans. That left the zealot John of Giscala and the Sicarii leader Simon Bar Giora. Even in the face of the Roman existential threat, the two could not agree. They burnt each other's grain supplies to convince the people to fight rather than surrender. The city rapidly devolved into famine. As Josephus said, quote, "It was now a miserable case. Children pulled the very morsels that their fathers were eating out of their very mouths. And what was still more to be pitied, so did the mothers do as to their infants. And the seditious everywhere snatched away from them what they had gotten from others, and this by force. The old men were beaten, and if the women hid what they had within their hands, their hair was torn for so doing. But they lifted up children from the ground as they hung upon the morsels they had gotten, and shook them down upon the floor. They also invented terrible methods of torments to discover where any food was. And they were to stop up the passages of the privy parts of the miserable wretches, and to drive sharp stakes up their fundaments." Quote, Vespasian had been content to suppress the rebellion in the areas around Jerusalem. That sent waves of refugees into the fortified but miserable capital. Titus was bolder. He moved slowly and with determination towards Jerusalem. By April 70, Titus had constructed a trench and wall around the entire city. Over the next few months, Titus breached the 3 walls protecting the city. Jerusalem was put to the torch and pillaged. Josephus claims as many as 1 million may have died. Other Roman historians put the number as half as much. Neither figure is likely. At best we can figure out the entire region of Judea was home to at most 1 million souls, and probably half as many. Nonetheless, the loss of life was enormous. Most of the survivors were enslaved. Apart from the terrible loss of humanity, the temple was burnt to the ground and the city ransacked. In Jewish tradition, this cataclysm occurred on Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of the month of Av, sometime in August 70. On this date, custom holds that during their storied history, many other calamities befell the Jewish people. Josephus tells us that Titus wished to spare the temple, and its destruction was an accident. Josephus was a partisan enthusiast of Titus and his father, so his account must be suspect. Some resistance pockets persevered for a few years. Most famous of these was the fortress of Masada. Masada is a mesa, its sheer sides forming a natural defence. Herod the Great built a summer palace and fort there, both for his own comfort and protection from his own downtrodden subjects. Josephus recounts that its 1,000 defenders determined to leave this world as free rather than as slaves, and so they committed mass suicide. In the next few episodes, I pursue the consequences of the Great Revolt for both the Judeans and the little cult of the Christians. Thanks for visiting. For show notes, maps, charts, and timelines, visit my website at www.historyinthebible.com. You can even download professional posters for free.